February 25, 1964. Van Gelder Studio, Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. The room is smaller than most people imagine. Intimate, almost claustrophobic. Rudy Van Gelder had converted his parents' living room into this recording space 13 years earlier, and somehow, the domestic origins still lingered in the acoustics. The walls absorbed sound differently here. Jazz breathed differently here. 5 musicians gather. A 36-year-old multi-instrumentalist from Los Angeles, an 18-year-old drummer who'd already revolutionized rhythm, a vibraphonist replacing what everyone expected would be a piano, a bassist who could make his instrument sing like a voice, a trumpeter who'd been Dolphy's roommate when they first came to New York. They're about to record an album in a single day. No overdubs, no second chances, just 2-track analog tape capturing whatever happens when these 5 men decide to explore the outer edges of jazz. The album cover that Blue Note's Reed Miles will design shows a curious detail, a shop window displaying a "We'll Be Back" sign above a clock. But this isn't any ordinary clock. It has 7 hands, each pointing in a different direction. A physical impossibility that perfectly captures what's about to happen in this room. Because on this cold February day, Eric Dolphy and his quintet are about to create Out to Lunch, an album that would redefine what avant-garde jazz could be. And in just 4 months, Dolphy would be dead, making this masterpiece also his farewell. But nobody knows that yet. Right now, in Van Gelder's living room turned cathedral of sound, there's only the music. Eric Allen Dolphy Jr. was born in Los Angeles on June 20, 1928, to parents of West Indian descent. His childhood home had a studio in the backyard where his mother Sadie would later remember him practicing for hours, the sounds of clarinet, saxophone, and eventually that uncommon instrument, the bass clarinet, filling their neighborhood. What set Dolphy apart wasn't just technical mastery. It was how he heard the world. He would practice alongside flocks of birds, trying to capture their vocal patterns on his instruments. He studied with Italian classical flautist Severino Gazzelloni, bringing European classical techniques into jazz contexts. He listened to modern composers, Béla Bartók, Edgar Varese, Anton Webern, with the same intensity he devoted to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. He was of African, Portuguese, and Chinese descent, jazz historians would later note. But Dolphy's musical heritage was even more diverse. He was a man who refused to choose between traditions. Why play bebop or classical when you could synthesize both? Why stick to alto saxophone when the bass clarinet could make sounds no one had heard before? By the late 1950s, Dolphy had moved to New York and begun working with Charles Mingus. The volatile bassist recognized something in Dolphy, a fearlessness, a willingness to go wherever the music demanded. Mingus later said of Dolphy, "Usually when a man dies you remember, or you say you remember, only the good things about him. With Eric, that's all you could remember. I don't remember any drags he did to anybody." John Coltrane, another musical revolutionary, became a close friend and collaborator. They played together at the Village Vanguard in 1961, pushing each other toward increasingly free improvisation. Coltrane later said, "Whatever I'd say would be an understatement. I can only say my life was made much better by knowing him. He was one of the greatest people I've ever known, as a man, a friend, and a musician." But Dolphy was also composing, developing his own musical vision. Albums like Outward Bound and Out There showed a musician honoring bebop tradition while simultaneously transcending it. And by early 1964, he was ready for his most ambitious statement. Alfred Lion and Francis Wolff, 2 German Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany, founded Blue Note Records in 1939 with a simple philosophy: let musicians make the music they wanted to make. Lion would tell his artists, "It must swing," using his characteristic German accent, but otherwise he gave them unprecedented creative freedom. By 1964, Blue Note was at its creative peak. Hard bop, soul jazz, and increasingly avant-garde experiments filled their catalog. Thelonious Monk, Art Blakey, Horace Silver, Lee Morgan, the roster read like a who's who of modern jazz. And now they wanted Eric Dolphy. What's remarkable is that Out to Lunch would be Dolphy's only album as a leader for Blue Note. He'd appeared as a sideman before, but Lion was offering him something precious, a full session, complete artistic control, and Rudy Van Gelder's golden ears at the mixing board. Dolphy assembled his dream quintet. Freddie Hubbard, the trumpeter he'd roomed with when they first arrived in New York, had already appeared on Dolphy's debut Outward Bound 4 years earlier. They had history, trust, and a shared willingness to take risks. Bobby Hutcherson on vibraphone was a crucial choice. Most jazz groups used piano, but Dolphy wanted something different. Bobby's vibes have a freer, more open sound than a piano, he explained. Piano seem to control you. Bobby's vibes seems to open you up. Hutcherson had participated in Dolphy's July 1963 sessions for Iron Man and Conversations, and his ability to move between percussive attacks and shimmering sustain made him perfect for what Dolphy had in mind. Richard Davis on bass was another returning collaborator. They'd recorded remarkable duets together. Come Sunday, Ode to Charlie Parker, Alone Together, that showcased an almost telepathic connection. One reviewer noted they communicated almost telepathically, as if completing each other's thoughts. Davis brought not just technical virtuosity, but a melodic sensibility that could match Dolphy's instrumental singing. And then there was Tony Williams. Just 18 years old, already a member of Miles Davis's groundbreaking quintet, Williams was redefining what jazz drumming could be. Miles Davis himself had said, "Tony was always the center that the group's sound revolved around." The teenager could imply rhythm rather than state it explicitly, creating space for others to explore while maintaining an invisible pulse that held everything together. "Everyone's a leader in this session," Dolphy wrote in the liner notes. It wasn't false modesty. This was jazz as democracy, 5 equal voices in conversation. The session begins with Hat and Beard, Dolphy's tribute to Thelonious Monk. The title refers to Monk's distinctive appearance, but more importantly, it captures his musical essence. "He's so musical no matter what he's doing, even if he's just walking around," Dolphy said of Monk. The piece opens with lurching, angular phrases in 9/4 time. Uncomfortable, unpredictable, thrilling. Dolphy's bass clarinet snakes through the changes while Williams and Davis create a foundation that's both solid and constantly shifting. Hutcherson's vibes add percussive jabs and shimmering accents. It's music that refuses to sit still. Something sweet, something tender, showcases a different Dolphy, lyrical, almost romantic, but still unconventional. The piece features a scored duet between Dolphy's bass clarinet and Davis's bowed bass, creating textures that sound more like chamber music than jazz. It's proof that avant-garde doesn't mean abandoning beauty. Gazzaloni, the album's only flute feature, pays homage to classical flautist Severino Gazzaloni, Dolphy's teacher. Here, Dolphy demonstrates that he could match virtuosos in any genre. The piece starts with the most conventional bebop-based theme on the album for the first 13 bars. Then, as Dolphy noted, freedom. The structure dissolves into rapid, twisting improvisations that push the flute to its technical limits. The title track, Out to Lunch, is where the album fully embraces its avant-garde mission. The 12-minute piece implies rhythm rather than stating it explicitly. "Notice Tony," Dolphy said. "He doesn't play time, he plays. Even though the rhythm section breaks the time up, there's a basic pulse coming from inside the tune. That's the pulse the musicians have to play." Williams at 18 shows why Miles Davis had grabbed him so quickly. He floats across the rhythms, coloring rather than dictating, responding to every shift in dynamics and mood. It's drumming that listens, that breathes with the other musicians. The album closes with Straight Up and Down, a piece about, of all things, a drunkard walking. The wobble and weave are built into the melody itself, creating a sense of controlled chaos. After a break of inebriated free playing, the group returns to the theme, walking the straight line without a misstep. It's humor and virtuosity combined, showing that experimental jazz could also have a sense of play. 42 minutes, 5 compositions, one extraordinary day. What Van Gelder captured on February 25th was revolutionary in ways both obvious and subtle. The absence of piano forced everyone to rethink their roles. Without those harmonic anchors, the music could breathe differently. Hutcherson's vibraphone became the album's secret weapon. He could punctuate with sharp attacks, sustain with shimmering overtones, or lay out entirely, creating dramatic silences. His playing on Hat and Beard has what one critic called a prankster vibe, unpredictable floating accents and wink-in-the-eye drop-ins. Davis, freed from walking conventional bass lines, created two-note chords and melodic excursions. Sometimes he bowed his bass, creating sustained tones that functioned like a missing piano's sustained chords. Richard doesn't play the usual bass lines. Dolphy explained. He plays rhythm with his lines. He leads you somewhere else. The result was space. Actual silence between notes, room for ideas to resonate before the next musical thought arrived. In an era when many jazz albums felt cluttered with sound, Out to Lunch dared to breathe. Van Gelder's engineering captured every detail. The intimacy of his studio meant you could hear fingers on keys, breath through reeds, the attack of mallets on vibraphone bars. This wasn't studio magic or technological trickery. This was 5 musicians in a room, and you were there with them. The album was recorded directly to 2-track analog tape. No multi-track recording, no mixing, no fixing mistakes in post-production. What you hear is what happened, the first and only take of these musical conversations. After the session, Dolphy returned to Van Gelder's studio less than a month later, appearing as a sideman on Andrew Hill's Point of Departure. That session, held on March 21, 1964, would become another avant-garde landmark, with Dolphy contributing his distinctive voice to Hill's complex compositions. But Dolphy was already looking toward Europe. In the original liner notes for Out to Lunch, he wrote words that now read as eerily prophetic. I'm going to live in Europe for a while. Why? Because I can get more work there playing my own music. And because if you try to do anything different in this country, people put you down for it. American jazz critics had been harsh. Some called his music anti-jazz. Miles Davis, despite his own experimental leanings, famously said he'd like to stomp on Dolphy's head. The avant-garde was threatening to jazz purists who wanted their music to swing in familiar ways. Europe promised something different. Audiences who embraced musical experimentation, venues that would book his projects, a cultural atmosphere less constrained by commercial expectations. In early 1964, Dolphy joined Charles Mingus's sextet for a European tour. The group played at Cornell University and Town Hall in New York before heading across the Atlantic. During a concert in Oslo, Norway, Dolphy informed Mingus that he planned to stay in Europe after the tour finished. Mingus, hurt but understanding, renamed the blues they'd been performing So Long Eric. Dolphy had made plans. His fiancée, Joyce Mordecai, was working in the ballet scene in Paris. He intended to marry her, settle in Europe, continue his musical explorations. He'd left papers and effects with friends Hale and Juanita Smith in New York. Not because he expected never to return, but because he was starting a new chapter. He was composing a string quartet. He was preparing to study with Nadia Boulanger, the legendary composition teacher who had taught Aaron Copland, Philip Glass, and countless others. At 36, Dolphy was entering what should have been his artistic prime. On June 27th, Dolphy arrived in Berlin for the opening of a jazz club called The Tangent. He was scheduled to play with a trio led by pianist Karl Berger. The gig was routine, another night in a career filled with performances. But something was wrong. When the show promoter came to get Dolphy, he found the musician lying on a hotel bed, sweating, devouring ice cream. Dolphy seemed ill but refused to see a doctor. He went to the club anyway. The exact details remain disputed, but most accounts agree. Dolphy collapsed, either on stage or shortly after performing. He fell into a diabetic coma, a condition he reportedly didn't know he had. What happened next is where tragedy compounds into something darker. Dolphy was taken to a Berlin hospital. The attending physicians, seeing a black American jazz musician who had collapsed, made an assumption based on stereotype rather than diagnosis. Drug overdose. When Eric got sick on that date in Berlin, and him being black and a jazz musician, they thought he was a junkie. Ted Curson, Dolphy's friend and fellow musician, later recalled, Eric didn't use any drugs. He was a diabetic. All they had to do was take a blood test, and they would have found that out. So he died for nothing. They gave him some detox stuff, and he died, and nobody ever went into that club in Berlin again. That was the end of that club. Dolphy was teetotal. He took a dim view of drugs. His personality was described as soft-spoken, bookish, someone who abjured drugs and drink and prioritized brainpower over instrumental flash. But none of that mattered to doctors who saw what they expected to see rather than what was actually in front of them. On June 29, 1964, Eric Dolphy died. He was 36 years old. Out to Lunch was released in August 1964, 2 months after Dolphy's death. The album he would never hear in its finished form. Critical response was mixed. Jazz purists found it too radical, too divorced from swing and melody. But others recognized something extraordinary. The album represented what A.B. Spellman, who wrote the original liner notes, called music that was not to roller skate by. Reed Miles's cover design, that seven-handed clock, that "We'll be back" sign, took on new, haunting meaning. Dolphy wouldn't be back, but the music remained, pointing in 7 directions simultaneously, suggesting possibilities that still haven't been fully explored. What's remarkable about Out to Lunch is how it occupies a space between categories. It's not strictly free jazz. There are composed themes, structural frameworks, recognizable forms. But it's also not conventional post-bop. It navigates what one critic called the no man's land between post-bop and free jazz. The album influenced everyone. You can hear it in Anthony Braxton's Formal Experiments, in the AACM's blend of jazz and contemporary classical music, in ECM Records' chamber jazz aesthetic, which wouldn't emerge until the 1970s, but owes much to Dolphy's vision of space and texture. John Coltrane, already moving toward increasingly free improvisation, absorbed lessons from Out to Lunch, his own late-period masterworks, Ascension, Interstellar Space, owe debts to Dolphy's willingness to push boundaries while maintaining musical coherence. The quintet that recorded Out to Lunch scattered to remarkable careers. Freddie Hubbard became one of the most important trumpeters of the 1960s and 70s, recording extensively for Blue Note and later CTI Records. His playing combined bebop virtuosity with more experimental leanings, a balance Dolphy would have appreciated. Bobby Hutcherson remained at the forefront of avant-garde and post-bop vibraphone, recording classics like Dialogue and Components. He remembered Dolphy with deep affection. They never seemed like outsiders, he said of Blue Note's founders Lion and Wolf. They didn't play an instrument and they had heavy German accents, but they were just one of us. The same could be said of Dolphy himself. Richard Davis became one of the most recorded bassists in history, appearing on everything from Van Morrison's Astral Weeks to countless classical recordings. His versatility, bowing, pizzicato, melodic invention was on full display in those 42 minutes with Dolphy. Tony Williams continued revolutionizing jazz drumming with Miles Davis before forming his own fusion group, Lifetime, which pioneered the marriage of jazz technique and rock energy. He died suddenly in 1997 at age 51, following gallbladder surgery complications. Another gifted musician taken too soon. Each carried forward something of what happened in Van Gelder's studio that February day. The lesson of Out to Lunch wasn't a specific musical technique but an approach. Respect tradition, then transcend it. Listen to each other. Make space for ideas to breathe. Don't fear the unconventional. 60 years later, Out to Lunch remains startling. Play it for someone unfamiliar with jazz history. Don't tell them when it was recorded, and they'll assume it's recent, perhaps contemporary experimental music from the 2010s or 2020s. Steve Huey of AllMusic called it Dolphy's magnum opus, an absolute pinnacle of avant-garde jazz in any form or era. Its rhythmic complexity was perhaps unrivaled since Dave Brubeck's Time Out, and its 5 Dolphy originals were a perfect balance of structured frameworks, carefully calibrated timbres, and generous individual freedom. NPR's Kevin Whitehead noted, "Half a century later it still sounds crazy in a good way." The organized mayhem starts with Dolphy's tunes, often featuring wide leaps in the melody and ratchet gear rhythms. The album influenced not just jazz but experimental music broadly. You can hear its DNA in contemporary artists exploring the boundaries between composition and improvisation, between structure and freedom, between accessibility and challenge. What makes Out to Lunch endure isn't just its musical innovation but its emotional honesty. This isn't abstraction for abstraction's sake. Behind the angular melodies and fractured rhythms, there's passion, humor, tenderness, intellect, a complete artistic personality. Dolphy once said about his music, "When you hear music after it's over, it's gone in the air. You can never capture it again." But he was wrong about that. Rudy Van Gelder captured those 42 minutes perfectly. They remain as vivid today as they were on February 25, 1964. The tragedy is what we lost. The string quartet Dolphy never finished. The collaborations with Nadia Boulanger that never happened. The decades of music he should have created. John Coltrane gave Dolphy's mother his unused instruments after Eric's death, playing the bass clarinet and flute on several albums before his own death in 1967. A musical inheritance, friend to friend. In 2014, marking 50 years since Dolphy's death, Berlin-based pianists Alexander von Schlippenbach and Aki Takase led a project titled So Long, Eric, the name Mingus had given that final blues. Musicians gathered to celebrate Dolphy's music, to honor his vision, to prove that even in death, he hadn't disappeared. 5 boxes of Dolphy's music papers, scores, lead sheets, sketchbooks, were donated to the Library of Congress in 2014. Among them were holograph scores and sketches for Out to Lunch, showing how Dolphy constructed these pieces, how he thought about structure and freedom simultaneously. The album stands alongside John Coltrane's A Love Supreme and Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come as one of the essential statements of 1960s jazz. But it's more than historical importance. Out to Lunch remains a living document, music that continues to challenge, inspire, and reward deep listening. That 7-handed clock keeps ticking, pointing in all directions at once, toward bebop's past, toward free jazz's future, toward classical music's techniques, toward sounds that still haven't been fully explored. Eric Dolphy died at 36. But those 42 minutes he recorded on that February day suggest a musical vision that will never age. As one critic wrote, jazz before and after Dolphy's swan song are 2 different things. The album's final lesson might be the simplest. Fear nothing. Follow the music wherever it leads. Trust your collaborators. Make space for the unexpected. And above all, as Dolphy himself said, play what you hear, not what you're supposed to hear. Out to Lunch isn't just a title. It's an invitation to step outside conventional thinking, to explore musical territories that don't appear on any map, to discover that the most important musical rules are the ones you make up as you go along. The clock with 7 hands keeps time in ways we're still learning to understand.